Washington mornings on the Mall.
105.9 FM.
And AM 630.
WMAL.
7:07 on WMAL, where Washington comes to talk. At 8:05, townhall.com's Katie Pavlich joins us to talk about the latest developments in the national conversation on guns in America. Also, at the bottom of this hour, a Supreme Court justice has made some startling public announcements about her support of affirmative action. This is right before the Supremes actually take up a case. That's interesting. I'm Larry O'Connor alongside Brian Wilson.
On the line right now, our good friend, our legal analyst, Joe DiGenova. Joe, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great. Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Joe.
At the bottom of the last hour, at the end of the hour, I was talking about David Gregory and how there we see on television the conclusive evidence that he is violating the law by holding up a high-capacity magazine on the air when in the District of Columbia, as we all know, those are not allowed. Now, the Office of Attorney General has looked at this matter and has decided to use its prosecutorial discretion, and they're not bringing charges against Mr. Gregory. But I'm not sure that they should have. But, I mean, how do you make a decision in a case like that to decide, well, yes, technically he broke the law, but it's not something we're going to prosecute?
Well, in the old days when I was U.S. Attorney and we had what they call the Corporation Counsel, now they call the local city prosecutor for minor offenses and misdemeanors, the D.C. Attorney General, and he was the one that made this decision. We used to have an agreement that all gun cases were prosecuted, no matter what they were, and the purpose was to make it clear to everybody that the rules were clear and they applied everybody. Just to give you an example, when I was U.S. Attorney, we actually prosecuted Ted Kennedy's bodyguards from California who walked into the Capitol with automatic weapons. They turned them in, thought they were fine. The Capitol Police seized the weapons and the magazines that they had, and they were prosecuted for misdemeanors. They litigated that for years and lost in the Court of Appeals. So what should have happened with David Gregory is very simple. He should have either been prosecuted or NBC Corporation should have been prosecuted. Not to prosecute this case sends a very bad signal that gun laws will be applied differently to different people. You cannot have that if you're going to have strict laws. You know,
I'm not sure that he should have been charged in the grand scheme of things, but I'm wondering, is there now a precedent?
Oh, there is.
And if somebody gets stopped because they wandered into the District of Columbia and forgot that there was an empty magazine in the back seat of their car, and they get stopped, are they going to get the same break that David Gregory got?
No, they are not. And by the way, the magazine, the empty magazine, the gun in transit through the District of Columbia, those stops and cases happen almost every day.
Yep.
There are hundreds of gun cases that are prosecuted each year of innocent people who come from out of town to visit as tourists who bring a weapon thinking legally they have the right to do it, which of course they don't. Now, this is a problem. They have set up in jury-demandable cases. Remember, these cases involve jury trials. They are misdemeanors. You are entitled to a jury trial. Jurors know that the laws are being applied unevenly. This was a big mistake. NBC News, the corporation, should have been prosecuted. Not necessarily David Gregory, although that would have been justified. He could have been charged. It would have been a perfectly proper thing to do. But to charge no one in this situation, by the way, the purpose of displaying the magazine was not to educate, it was to embarrass Wayne LaPierre. It had nothing to do with educating the public.
Joe DiGenova, you talk about bringing these things in across the border into D.C. Well, one of those borders, if the Governor O'Malley has his way, the border of Maryland, will not necessarily be available for free flow of any types of these objects either, because he wants to push some laws there in Maryland that are going to be much, much tougher than they already even have.
Yeah.
What kind of leeway does a state have here with regard to gun laws that still will fall and pass muster with the Second Amendment?
Well, that's unclear now. That's why all of this is going to take several years to develop. Now that the Supreme Court has established a right under the Second Amendment of personal possession of guns.
That's the Heller decision, right?
That's right. A constitutional right of personal possession. It's going to have to be litigated as to what the limits around that are. Martin O'Malley, of course, has presidential ambitions, and he's going to push very hard for a sweeping ban on assault weapons, magazines. I mean, it'll be the entire left-wing agenda for gun control. And it is quite possible that the Maryland General Assembly, given its context, which is almost 100% Democratic on both sides, they control both houses, will get some, if not all, of those restrictions. That is why people are buying weapons now, and I predict there's going to be huge gun purchases by Marylanders from both out of state.
Anecdotally, I hear that's already the case.
Oh, it's underway, and that's why you can't buy certain guns and certain magazines because they are not in stock.
Hey, Joe DiGenova, in the last hour we spoke about the inflammatory language that Colin Powell used yesterday on Meet the Press and hammering the Republican Party. You may have heard it.
I did.
I said a lot about what the former Secretary of State has done and said in his criticism of the Republican Party, but I completely neglected his role in the Scooter Libby scandal. And I would let you were there. I'd love to hear from you about that.
I think one of the most disgraceful parts of Colin Powell's history is the way he sat silently by and allowed Scooter Libby to be charged improperly for leaking the name of Valerie Plame when Colin Powell knew personally that Richard Armitage, his Deputy Secretary of State, was actually the person who first leaked Valerie Plame's name to Robert Novak. And Powell sat silently by through the entire mocking of Scooter Libby, this disgraceful lynching of Scooter Libby, said nothing publicly, said nothing to the President of the United States, even though George W. Bush had asked anyone who knew anything to come forward and let him know. Colin Powell sat there in a foxhole with his friend Richard Armitage. And let me repeat this one more time. It was Richard Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State, who leaked the name of Valerie Plame to Robert Novak. It was not Scooter Libby. And I think that Colin Powell's performance in that event is one of the most disgraceful performances by a public official in history.
And the leaking of Valerie Plame's information, the fact who she was and how she was connected to the entire story, that became a talking point that the left used to hammer the Bush administration and suggest that they were in some way, intimidating people who disagreed with them and were willing to out a CIA operative. When it was, and here it was his darling, it was the left's darling, Colin Powell's associate, who did it, and Powell knew about it.
And by the way, talking of double standards, look at how this administration has leaked information, classified information to the press with no penalty whatsoever. And by the way, when John Brennan comes up for confirmation hearings, if the Senate Intelligence Committee does not keenly interrogate him about his role in the leaks to the New York Times and other news organizations, they should give up their jobs. But Colin Powell, historically, will be the marker for disgraceful conduct involving a colleague. He well knew that Scooter Libby did not leak that name of Valerie Plame to Robert Novak. He stood silent. He never said anything publicly or privately. That was a disgraceful performance.
Joe DiGenova bringing the juicy sound bites this morning on Mornings on the Mall. Thanks, Joe.
Joe, it's always a pleasure.